Okay, so I'm going to concentrate mostly on one element of what Dorette said when she got a laugh, when she knew she only had a couple of minutes left, and said, it's heritable. And so I'm going to try and convince you, there'll be data in the talk, but mostly to convince you that behaviour genetics is not just finding that it's heritable and that because everything's heritable that it doesn't matter, but to try and convince you that we have a contrast, I guess, in our heads between behaviour genetics meetings, which are enormous samples, data-driven, very powerful, and then meetings like ISSID, where everyone's got their own theory, lots of ideas, and that you can test your theories using behaviour genetics, and you can do it in really powerful ways that show that some theories are right and some are wrong. And if you decide that that's right, you can come to BGA in Edinburgh in 2012, next year, off year for ISSID, but might pop up to Edinburgh and say hello. So just two thoughts, I think, in the whole talk. The stuff that we talk about here is at the heart of society's most pressing concerns. And getting it right really matters. It matters whether when we disagree with each other, which one of us is right, because there are enormous decisions about how people will behave that hang on that. And secondly, that if everything's heritable, then you need behaviour genetic designs to test almost anything in social science, and that people should, that you can't really test social science ideas without doing that. And two goals, backing up those two ideas, that to get you to think more of behaviour genetics in terms of a way of testing theories, and maybe even going to the point of a series of tools that you can incorporate into your own experiments, and some of them are quite simple. So other things we study, really important, they're on the newspaper headlines every day. How many people from a certain SES background should we expect in Oxford University or going into certain jobs? What are the origins of these things? How can we increase wealth and entrepreneurship? What's the cause of health or longevity? Physical health changes that are really pressing issues as we become an ageing population. And the list is endless, and they're all relevant and important. How do we study these things that we know are biologically influenced? Well, 90% of the time we have surveys, and about 10% of the time perhaps we have genes, just in a quick sort of search. And there's a problem with that. George Davey-Smith gave a great talk at the last epidemiology meeting, highlighting this fact that taking vitamin C reduces car accidents by 40%. And it's a lovely example because it's so implausible mechanistically. But you can control for SES and all kinds of background variables, and it really does look like if you're taking vitamin C, reduces it's even dose dependent. And 99% of what comes out of those kinds of studies is going to be nonsense because it's riding on the back of a whole bunch of things that are causal, and you can't separate them. And if you haven't come across Davey Smith's work, or else, especially too, from I don't know what point that you can't see, but go and read some of Ionides' papers. There are some things that are going wrong in science about how we run ourselves as a business that are causing us to generate these very desired answers, but in very flawed paradigms. And more fundamentally, I think this is a nice quote from George Box, a Box-Cox statistician, married Fisher's daughter, I think. To find out what happens to a system when you interfere with it, you have to interfere with it. You can't just passively observe it, that you have to juggle something. And what twins and other genetically informed models do is give us a way of nature having done that juggling for us, which is what makes them so powerful. A really simple design you can think of, well, let's just control for things in the family. The paper that Ian and Jeff Durr and I did a few years ago was taking advantage of nesting boys and girls in a family that controls for a whole range of things, including average genetic potential, apart from on their X and Y chromosomes, which was the experimental variable. Here we're wondering, does variance change with IQ? And you can see that the proportion of males at very low and very high ends of the distribution is greater. So there's something that you get by taking advantage of a natural genetic grouping, a family. And of course it's confounding things they're learning in the family with their genes, but we can move on. The simplest design, the one that maps most onto what we do in psychology normally, giving people a treatment, is if we've got a functional molecular marker. We've got a causal allele, we can measure it, see what happens in two groups. Taking an example of breastfeeding as a common myth, this is from The Spectator. Bottle-fed boys go this way, people go this way, and breastfed go that way because you'll be in different worlds. And it's quite a big IQ difference between these two groups. Interesting paper, Caspian Moffat, 2007, another interaction with no main effect. And it's got a mechanism, fatty acid desaturase, which would make you dependent on getting on puffers in breast milk, so it kind of makes sense. And it has got a massive effect, 7 IQ points. And it only worked in people who had one version of this FADS2 gene, but something like 80% of people have got that version. So it's an enormous effect. We could basically wipe out the effects of class if we just did this. So we follow it up and have a look, and there's now two completely independent papers out there, another one from the Bristol group. 3,000 people we had, the twins are 12 to 16, mothers asked to report independent feeding practice for their twins, and just no effect whatsoever. And in George Davey-Smith's group, they found a significant effect, but it was the exact opposite way around. And so it seems likely this is not the case. But it's nice to know that it's not the case. It's nice to know that you're not damaging your children by bottle feeding them. It's sad to know that we can't raise our IQ by 6 points. That's the exciting stuff, and Doretta's right to point out molecular psychiatry, genes are where we're really going to find the mechanical mechanisms, but what about behaviour genetics? Should we just forget about that? Is it old hat? It's got assumptions you hear on Radio 4 most weeks about we can just ignore everything that comes from twin studies because we know that it's just a snapshot and it doesn't matter what the heritability is, it could move to any point, so anybody can still do anything. So I want to argue just briefly that that's not going to be the case. So 2 reasons why it's not the case. We can test a lot of theories. A lot of theories say that what happens in the family matters. So there we can estimate what's the effect of children being in the same family. That should make DZ twins really similar. So there's a lot of tests we can reject if we find that C is low. And we know that there are causal confounds built into epidemiological studies that we need to be able to control for. So we want to be doing these studies for those reasons. I'll begin with some complex designs, multivariate designs, where it's obvious that behaviour genetics is helping us test theories. Tons of stuff that I can't talk about, genetic correlations, longitudinal models that Direct began to touch on. They're really interesting, extended twin designs, assortative mating. Let's look at a common pathway model. You can learn more about the genetics of psychological well-being. Go and see a poster by Despina Akuntaki this week. But this model is making a strong theoretical claim. Because it's taking A, C, and E and forcing them through a latent variable, it's saying there's one module or system in your brain, your mind, which is mediating the family environment, unique environments. It's all the genes are being expressed in there, and then it is being expressed in these different behaviours that you're measuring. If that model fits, it's telling you something about the structure of the mind, just as a neuropsychology experiment tells you something about the structure of the mind. I'll use one brief example that a fantastic PhD student, Gary Lewis, and I have been working on favouritism. So we're more likely to give money to our children than we are to strangers that we meet in the street. Some people like to associate with people in the same religion as they are, or have ethnic favouritism, or like to associate with people of the same race. Why is that? And it turns out there are 2 competing theories, and we can test these. And one of the theories is that, well, that's a sort of big general mechanism. It goes through that common pathway. There's some system in your head, and maybe it's just working memory and cognition, that you can deploy randomly to any kind of grouping. And there's another theory, which has got about as much evidence supporting it, which is that, no, we've evolved some specific things to try and see how related is this person to me, and we automatically and effortlessly extract that information. So 2 different models of why we form groups and become favoritistic. The outcome in a paper that we published is that favoritism is quite heritable, but this common pathway model fit. And that tells us that there is some common system which can be deployed over different domains of favoritism, but we couldn't get rid of those bottom pieces of special stuff. So the brain has got in it some things which seem to be processing things like ethnicity and some general mechanisms. So 2 competing theories that have been around for a decade or so in social science, and we can apply this common pathway model to test which of them is right. And it turns out here they're both right or both wrong. We've got a theoretical advance in that way. Independent pathway model makes a very different set of predictions. I'm just going to skip over that. What about our boring friend, the univariate ACE model? We know that A is usually bigger than 0, that C is often small, and that E could be error, but it could be where all of the complex interactions and transactions and things are living. So, is this of any use? I think it's about as much use as a t-test. Of course, we've done t-tests on most things, but we won't teach children that anymore. That's all been done. There's lots of times when you can use a t-test. Univariate for behaviour genetics is actually multivariate. We're decomposing variants into multiple components, A, C, and E. And it's often very multivariate because we nearly always have a bunch of demographic stuff in the background there. Age and the neighbourhood that you grew up in, your SES. And so univariate models, I think, can be of a lot of value. How? Well, we're estimating C, so that tests claims about differences emerging from differences in how people are treated in their families. We can combine information from univariate studies across cohorts. Robert Plomin's, again, excellent PhD student, Claire Hayworth, published a terrific paper stitching together a whole range of estimates of IQ heritability over time. And it's a really interesting pattern of what's happening to heritability in C. And they're all mostly generated out of univariate reports. There are, if you look at them, almost no cognitive or personality variables that have been studied in a range of ages, across a range of SESs in a range of countries. You try and do that, and there's massive missing holes. So my request would be, yes, even more, lots more univariate studies. If that's all you can do, go and generate some, because there's tons of things that we just have never estimated. The demographic information opens a lot of doors for getting really interesting results. What's the source of variance? Are males more variable because of A or C or E? Quantitative and qualitative sex limitation that Direct touched on. It's an interesting and fascinating area that's hardly even the modelling has been explored well enough. You just don't see that being done. G by E interactions. Elliott and Page recently published a really interesting study expanding these ideas of IQ and SES interactions. And I just sort of smiled as I put this up. People think univariate is really simple. It's like, that's probably over the heads of many people. And all that we've done is just added one definition variable. But the maths gets pretty complicated, and you can start to find some pretty interesting, important things and test them with one, univariate. It's just a univariate ACE and a definition variable that we will almost always have collected. Plain Jane Koleski, that's not even a model, right? It can tell us some really important things. How many entities do we need to, Occam, it's the guy that's driving us with his razor to trim our theories back into shape. Do we really have to say this is not in the NEO? Maybe it is. Maybe the NEO explains it. So an example here, if you pop across and see Christine Macari's poster, are there genes for magical thinking? So work that she and Nick Martin and Ulrich Ettinger have been doing, just to Koleski to say, once you know about genes for neuroticism and for physical anhedonia, social anhedonia, for hypermania, do we need to posit any more genes for these apparently, must-have genes, weird delusions, magical thinking that television is talking to you? It's all explained, mostly by neuroticism, a few other things. There's nothing left. That's a powerful result in terms of thinking about what schizophrenia is where it's coming from. So I'm going to go out with a bang. It's kind of with a loud whimper. We can test direction of causality. This is an issue that's really important for lots of the things that we're testing. You find two things go together. Are they just emerge? Is there correlation is not causation? We can answer that with a range of models. Longitudinal behaviour genetic data can begin to see whether genes are predicting the future or environments are predicting the future. But a really underused design that I think lots of people in the room could apply is discordant twins. And Dorette gave, I think, one example. I'm going to use another of her, again, excellent student, Marlene de Moore's work to look at what you can do with discordant twins. Something that you may have heard about is that exercise and depression are correlated, and people think that a way to make yourself feel happier would be to jog, do some exercise. And how can we tell whether that's right? The straightforward behaviour genetic design can tell us whether they're genetically correlated, but again, you could come out of the page here, and it might be that the reason why that genetic effect of exercise is shared with the genetic effect for depression is because when you're exercising, that environmentally comes up and changes your mood. If you take MZ twins, they don't differ genetically, grew up in the same family typically, and you'll find, let's just get the ones who are discordant. Here we've plotted the MZ1 minus MZ2 on our 2 dimensions. And what you're looking for is if one of these identical twins starts exercising a bit more, do they happen to also be the MZ twin who's a bit less depressed? If one of the twins, if you're the twin who's exercising a bit less, do you happen to be the twin who's a bit more depressed? It's a very interesting paper, and it really clearly lays out this method. Archives of General Psychiatry, 2008. Genetic correlation is large, between 0.2 and 0.4, depending on what affective measure you're looking at. Environmental causeway, 0. Not significant. So that's saying that there are some shared genetic mechanisms that are making people fit and jog and say that they're happy and not have mood disorder. But if you go and jog, it's not going to work. It only works for the people who are jogging because of this underlying shared genetic thing. So it's not what we think it is, which is a prescription. So we can discover molecular mechanisms in what occupies a sort of quarter or a third of my time with reading. It's worked really nicely so far. Robo1, DYX1, a stack of genes that people, and a lot of people here in Britain and around the world are working on. What about personality and IQ? That will be fun to break that down. We can test theories using genes. Is it right that breastfeeding raises IQ? Let's put in a little molecular marker and see whether we interfere with your ability to profit from breast milk. Does that impair your IQ? Turns out not to. You can test theories. How many entities are there? Koleski model. We can detect modules in the mind for favoritism. We can look for pleiotropies using independent pathways that I didn't get into. And we can also test causes. If you don't bother exercising for your well-being, because if it would work, you're already doing it. So I had started off with 2 goals, and if we have the stereotype between our 2 conferences, BJ and ISSID, data-driven, idea-driven, you can use those ideas and test them in behaviour genetics where people have already collected large samples. So let's try and power up the kind of individual differences research we do using some of these designs. And 2 thoughts. Getting what we do right, I think really does matter. We really are studying lots of the most important questions that society has. And if everything's heritable, then we really need to have these designs in. So the country needs you to be genetically informed in your work.